So I'll talk to you a little bit about what I refer to now as more of a journey than necessarily a specific case study, because it's obviously these things evolve. I like to start with this slide because, and I think the theme has been heard multiple times today, is, the things that we used to try to do or would like to have been able to do 10, 15 years ago just weren't so practical. Right? The processing power wasn't there. Maybe the technology hadn't caught up. Maybe it was a lot of academic ideas, things like optimization. It would look really cool in a study, but not necessarily something that you could sit down and implement. And particularly when I engaged on this particular activity of planning optimization, there was a fair amount of closed-mindedness about what was possible. All right, so anybody who's in this role, either you're pushing the ideas up, or you're encouraging the ideas down, or researching this for your own purpose. Open up your minds, realize things have changed. I'm not a supply chain guy. I'm not a planning guy. All right, I'm the guy that the executives call when things are really messed up and they need to get fixed. All right, so I have now very good insight into the planning and optimization and operations activities, but ultimately I'm the problem solver. And so my background is in engineering, it's in drive development, so I had a lot of experience there that helped lead into the improvements we were able to make in our planning systems. So overview, obviously, I'll talk to you a little bit about the problem we were trying to address, the solution strategy, what we ended up with, and then some key takeaways. If you don't know Western Digital, we manufacture hard disk drives, or better said, we manufacture digital storage devices. Okay, because it's no longer just a hard disk drive, right? It's no longer just a mechanical device. There's much more in the technology these days. But I think some key factors to understand while we're talking about this evolution is there's a couple of critical materials in this device that create the planning problem. Specifically, we have this right here is the head, and then you have this disc right here is the media, is the platter, right? And the combination of those two things together has a dramatic influence on the quality of the device that we output, has a dramatic quality on the yield of the device that we output, but we also have at our discretion a lot of flexibility of which of our heads and which of our media we can pair up. All right, so and I'll show you a very simplistic example in a moment of what that might look like, but it creates a horrible challenge for the planners who had historically been doing manual planning to be able to come up with a workable plan, let alone a plan that really was optimized to the benefit of the business. All right. The priority ultimately is I got to get the products, I got to meet demand. And the rest is great if I can get it done in time before the shift starts. Right. So yield, quality, cost, meeting demand, performance to demand, recycle consumption, a big one. These were some of our KPIs that were in scope that we were trying to address with this particular planning optimization project. Some of the things that were critical inputs, material performance. How do these combinations of materials tie together to give us a certain level of performance? And that could be, again, yield and such. Costs, and then there were various constraints about what we could do, what we couldn't do with particular materials as well. The real problem, the challenge was that every day we're trying to build these hard disk drives and the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, and we have many legitimate material combinations, 1,000 or more active legitimate combinations, and in fact we have millions of combinations, but you got to be realistic, and we narrow that down to a handful, and some of those combinations come out as an artifact of having built everything that we intended to build for the day and having leftover parts from the day before, and so we're trying to mix in those recycled materials, so they might not be part of our mainstream production plan, but we want to get those off the get those materials off the floor. So when this problem was brought to my attention, we were having this issue, we weren't using the materials the way we had anticipated, the way that product engineering had gone to the planners and said, hey, look, these are the materials I want my devices built with because this is going to give us the best output. And then I got the other product engineer coming over and say, hey, these are the materials I want used for my product because that's going to give me the best output. And the two of them hadn't necessarily talked to one another and realized that they were fighting over the same materials or fighting over yield that was to the detriment of another. Okay? So when we looked at this, and I kind of reflected back on this because honestly can't say we did it quite to this systematic level at the time. I went back and looked at what was our planning maturity at the time just to convey this message. And if you look at our process and our systems and our data inputs, relatively poor in terms of our maturity. The only thing that was good on this was, as a matter of necessity, is we were actually able to output a plan that was achievable. Otherwise, we wouldn't have shipped any devices, right? And then we're not making any money. So we were able to ship devices. We still ran into problems with line down and poor quality and such. Or I shouldn't say poor quality. We still met our quality requirements, but we could have done better. Okay. So we set out on a vision, and ultimately we wanted to get pretty much on data inputs and data outputs were effectively the most critical. We wanted to be able to make sure we had all of the input necessary to create a perfect plan, and we wanted a perfect plan as the output. And systems and process obviously are a critical component to that. At the end of the day, what was most important is producing our product as best we could. Okay. So the summary was we want to plan well, we want to optimize the plan competitively, which I think is lost in discussion oftentimes, particularly when you hear the word best practice, right? More and more I'm getting frustrated by the idea of best practice. It's not just best practice. It's doing better than your competitor, right? Best practice will get you equal to your competitor if they are doing best practice. The question is what's your secret sauce to do even better? Okay? And then obviously plan for excellence. So, apologize for the very basic, not very exciting slide here, but I wanted to drive home a point. So, in our world, at the simplest level, we're interested in heads and media. I threw in this, which is a motor-based assembly. And I've given a very simple example of two of each. Right? And as you can imagine, the result is, so I can pair up any of these with the others, and automatically you see with just a couple of products, a couple of heads of media, I've already created this massively challenging problem. Okay? And this is an example of me in inventory. I can jump in and, with some knowledge, if you will, gut knowledge, if we're doing planning process or experience, I know, for example, well, I'm not allowed to actually use these even though they show up in the material list. So I'm the planner going, okay, well, strike those for my options while I'm planning for today for my kitting. So the next thing is I want to build 100 of each, right? And I create my plan. And just at the most simple level, again, this is very basic, right? 101 stuff. I create my build plan, and I'm going to get a yield of 92.5. Now, this is a brute force. This is a great example of the planner just goes in. He says, okay, I got to meet my customer's demands. Okay? So I build it. I get my 92.5% yield, not to mention all the other concerns. Now, the outcome that may or may not be obvious to you is there's all sorts of numbers of ways I could have met that demand and achieved different yields. In this case, the obvious solution gave me a 92.5% yield, but the less obvious, the one that required me to think through it a little bit harder, gave me a point better. Now, this is the sort of problem that we're dealing with, right? But now put it into reality. Hundreds of model numbers, hundreds of SKUs for material, and various other factors. The hourly kitting, the line restrictions, the multiple factories, right? Different sites. Cycle time, quality requirements, customer material constraints. Are we going to get the material? Is it going to arrive on time? And what happens if it doesn't, right? And then the cost of those materials, coming up with the best balance on where to use those materials to get the best cost on product. And then the performance commits. Are we actually delivering what we expected? And by the way, are we doing what we told our leadership we were going to do in production? because the business is making plans around those commits. So I alluded to this before. Again, so many challenges came back to just getting people to kind of open their minds and understand that some of the things we're trying to adjust or address are not easy, but they are achievable. So when we looked at the problems and kind of began to understand what was going on, and we sort of put together this perspective of what was happening, right? One, and you guys are the experts in planning, right? It's a chess game. Every instant something's changing, right? And before you know it, what you thought you were going to do has already become, is no longer going to work. Right? So the other is we want to develop in our strategy and our perspective, at least in terms of how we deliver systems, and I think it was mentioned in one of the prior discussions, is we don't want to go for a big bang. I don't want to solve the world in this right now. I want small incremental solutions that get me one step closer, and by the way, build that case for opening that parachute, right? To think about the possibilities. So develop near-term wins while providing a long-term foundation. That was one of the perspectives we went in with. We want to invest in a competitive advantage. We want to differentiate. We don't want to just do what the other guy is doing. Don't expect an out-of-the-box solution. When we went into this, we looked at the problems. We said, okay, I can go down the street and I can buy that, whoever's selling what today is the out-of-the-box way-to-go solution, or I can be realistic and understand that this is a complex problem and it's not just going to be solved as simply as plugging something in and configuring a few knobs and go, well done, right? So, and the other perspective, just from a standard supply chain perspective and planning, was that we have our daily and hourly plans that we were looking at, our weekly plans, our monthly plans, and our quarterly plans. When we set out to address the problem, we had some options, and I point this out because I think it's an important consideration when you begin to look at your own problems and how to tackle them, and that that idea when whoever it is comes to you, or if it's you, goes and says, well, we're going to spend 2 years, we're going to create this big bang, problems are all going to go away. All right, that means in that context you're going to do this big bubble, right? I don't buy it. All right, but let's say I decide to go incremental. Well, I can do a top down in this view, right? I can start at my quarterly plan and optimize that, and then de-optimize it all the way down to my daily plan. So I'm basically taking my non-optimized low-level execution will basically nullify whatever work I had done up here. The alternative is to take all of this historical, this legacy activity that's going on, get at the front end of it and say, look, we recognize you guys are doing the best you can upstream, but we know you don't have all the tools you need yet to be, to be there, to be perfect, to be optimal. But we're going to take what you've given us and we're going to optimize that to do the best we can with what you've given us, right? So I have my bucket of materials or my buckets of materials. I'm going to take what you've given me. Thank you, good job. Now I got to go figure out how to make the best use of it, right? So that was the strategy that we took. And so we took this bottom-up concept and said, okay, I can do this today. I can make that incremental. I can demonstrate. I can quantify the results. And then I can make the argument and say, well, you know what, let's back in. Let's improve the weekly plan. Let's optimize that. And then I can take the monthly plan and optimize that and back up all the way to your quarterly planning. So our requirements that we were looking for at the time, we wanted a cohesive and systematic workflow for feeding information into the planning solution, whatever that may be. We wanted the ability to audit our inputs into the planning process. Who did what, when they did it, why they did it. All right, and I'm sure everyone here that's using spreadsheets has that perfectly under control. Yeah? Y'all have your worksheet audit capabilities? And obviously that was a key motivator in that particular bullet point. We wanted efficient information systems, and we want to overcome, and this is the real trick. Raise your hand if you're using Excel, by the way, for your planning. Only 2 people? 3, 4, 5? All right, and then the others that didn't raise their hand, right? We're all guilty of it, all right? So the challenge you have there is whatever solution you put in place, you're competing with Microsoft. That's a pretty big task, right? Pretty big shoes to fill when you go to your planners and say, hey, you know what? I've got something better. Better for me, not necessarily for you, because it's going to make your job more rigid, and they're going to be up in arms, right? So that's a big challenge you have, but that was a must-have in our view, was you got to get the spreadsheets off the table for exactly the reason that you can't audit them. You don't know what the inputs are. They're completely out of control. Format changes one day, everybody else is screwed up, that sort of problem. And then the process controls, making sure that people are doing what they're supposed to do, when they're supposed to do it, how they're supposed to do it. And then the structured planning tool for the components themselves. Now, and notice that I didn't say optimization was a must-have here, right? Important to have was the structured solution for mathematically optimal performance. But our house was so out of order already, getting this fixed, right? You got to get that done. The rest is then enabled by that work. And you'll see me mention that a little bit in a couple more slides. And one of the ideas, and I just mentioned this for the purpose of setting expectations when you do sort of this sort of optimization. I was actually tied in with, at the time we did this, with my group was called Strategic Programs and Analytics. And I was fortunate to have to be closely tied with some very sophisticated analytics folks. And a point well taken was, look, I can give these these optimized plans, but what's the confidence interval on those plans based on our past ability to execute the plans? So it's an interesting question, and not so much that we would, even though we did scope that possibility of implementing it, something you have to have in the back of your mind. If your variability and execution is so screwed up that you can't do your plan, don't even bother to optimize, right? Don't even bother with the worksheets. Just walk down and go down to the factory floor and tell them what to stick on the lines. If you're that bad. So knowing this becomes very interesting, and we had some manual things that we did in the interim to make sure that with our solution that we were in check and things were working the way we expected. So from a process perspective, from a putting together the project, so to speak, of course we needed to go through our comprehensive process review and mapping, make sure we understood who was doing what, and then re-engineer that process to support this sort of concept of optimized planning, right? Systematic planning, systematic workflows. Get as much of the emails out of the loop as possible, right? There were a number of peripheral systems that weren't really clearly defined. People didn't even necessarily know what they are, who owned them, who was the custodian, who were the stewards of those systems. So we needed to pull all of that together, get an understanding of that, and then establish a long-term architecture, right, for what it is we want to support in the future. And here's the bullet, right, the worksheet bullet again. All critical worksheets, we got rid of them. We made them systems. It's just, we worked real closely with the owners of those worksheets and said, look, we get it, but we got to move on, right? None of this is possible. It doesn't matter how small your planning organization is. I'll say executive buy-in is just absolutely critical in these processes. If you're the executive here today, you gotta stand on top of this thing and say it's gonna happen, right? If you're the poor IT guy that got handed the project and said go figure it out, you got to make sure that your executives are backing you up and they're standing on top of this and they're having the biweekly or quarterly or monthly, whatever it is, meetings that are demonstrating their commitment and effectively the status meetings to make sure that people are being held accountable to get it done. All right. So it's almost cliche. You read it in every book, but it's extremely important. In terms of building this solution, those short incremental deliverables, those short incremental demonstrations, proof of concepts, are also critical in building up, getting steam on this thing, rather than just going in and say, well, we're going to optimize and run with it and hope it works at the end. And by the way, it's as you're looking at these, who you partner with is going to have a big influence on this, right? Your decision to partner with whatever vendor and ultimately, lead out to the solution. Establish in a system like this, one, you got to establish the monetary value. Two, the really great thing is you can actually do it pretty quickly in the near term. It's not as simple as putting together the two-page example I showed before, right? The snippet, but demonstrating the value along the way, the real dollars makes a big difference. And frankly, it's not that hard to do. All right, and if nothing else will get the executive buy-in, that should. The formal, this gets down to basic project and program management stuff, but these formal kickoff processes also very important. You want to have the team set some very aggressive goals. You got to make sure that you have a technically competent team to do this work. They have to understand complexity of planning. They have to have the technical know-how, in my opinion, to be able to unravel it and establish a systematic implementation or solution. A couple of things that we did that I think were really important that led to part of the success. One, again, the executive reporting. We had weekly reporting, so it was very clear that this was critical. And that sense of urgency, and the war room was a huge, right? We basically had the team huddle into a war room, and they got after it. This isn't one of those IT projects that you let drag on for a couple of years and then come off and dust off and see what fell out. It really needs to be a concerted, aggressive effort. So the outcome, and I think I can get this done in 10 minutes. The outcome was, specifically, we had quantifiable results that we were able to compare the manual versus the optimized plan and demonstrate, in fact, that we had exceeded our intent, our estimates, which was very important. But we had improved planning, more efficient and systematic controlled processes. We had definitely improved morale, which was just really cool to go back and, I was living in Asia at the time and we deployed this project, and then I moved back home to California, and then a few months later I went over and they'd gotten over the brutality that I had influenced during the project, but they were just also thankful that their lives had been made that much easier and they were producing a better outcome. So definitely a morale improvement. Consistent compliance to the production rules. The line down things that were happening before because the kitting team was trying to mix materials that just simply weren't even allowed to be mixed. Those problems largely went away with the exception of last minute blocks on things that just couldn't get communicated fast enough. All right. And if you're not sure what I'm talking about in that context, basically we've got our heads in media materials, but in our MES we have blocking that says certain things aren't allowed to go with certain things. Right? And so a line will just stop if you try to load up a material that's not allowed to be paired for a particular SKU. All right? So we were having problems with that because of the manual planning. So that largely went away. We also had, and I don't know if I mentioned it here, but I will, that our ability to actually comply to the plan and get that benefit also dramatically improved. Right? So if we said build it with A and B, even though there's still flexibility, because the key, you got to keep the line running no matter what. So even though there was some flexibility, we found that we were much more successful in building the way it was intended to be built. We maximized the production yield as we had intended. Another interesting thing, so in our materials, if something doesn't work the first time through, we take it apart, send those materials back to the front of the line. They get labeled as recycle, and we can reuse them. It just, the SKU is different for that product, so and we have limits on which customers will accept how many recycled materials and things along those lines. And we were able to reduce that recycled material to the point that we had to figure out how to start planning our prime material purchases because we had done such a good job of using up our recycle. Now we had too many prime materials. We were overbuying, and we had to figure out what to do about that. I think that's a good problem to have, right? Our cycle time, our planning cycle time improved such that we were able, not so as dramatic as what Victor was talking about earlier with just, real time, on the dime changes to plans, but definitely able to get through multiple iterations of our planning cycle. If something changed, if a truck didn't show up when it was supposed to, we were able to go through an iteration and get an optimal plan based on that change. We ultimately we exceeded our NPV, and we actually had payback within 1 year. So the pain point improvements, real quick, we reduced the recycle inventory. We had more compliant planning, realistic plans, and we were able to maximize our yield, utilization, and quality. So our objective to go to this maturity level of maturity was achieved. We had well, I don't want to repeat, so I think everything here is pretty much been stated. Yep. So you get the idea here, I think. So key takeaway. And maybe I'm a little biased being in an architecture role, but first I'll say get your house in order. If you don't plan to walk out today and start optimizing, that's okay. But if your house is in order, is not in order when you pick up the phone and make that call and you start talking to your great partners to be, right? The first thing they're going to want to know is well, what's the information? What are the inputs? What are the outputs? What are your desired KPIs, and how do you want to perform against those? If you say, well, everything's in spreadsheets, you're just that much further away to being done. Okay, so start to get your house in order today. Define a proactive, long-term architecture, an extensible foundation. I know that's a lot of buzzwords, but simply put together your city plan, test yourself against it. Ask yourself, well, if I make this change, or if I plan to do this on my roadmap, does my foundation stand up to those long-term roadmap changes, right? That's the basics, okay? Get your data management in order. I think it was mentioned in one of the discussions earlier about the importance of quality data, right? If your outputs are only going to be as good as the quality of your inputs and your data, so you got to start getting that in order. Get rid of the spreadsheets today. It's hard, but you can start doing that today. It's going to make it that much easier when you're ready to run through an optimization process. Your processes, your workflows, start to make them systematic today. Improve them, re-engineer them, so that they can support this sort of process improvement or this sort of optimization improvements. Understanding your constraints and being able to provide that information and input that information into any system in a systematic way is also a critical component. Having the guy come down, having the product engineer walk over to your planner's desk and say, hey, today don't mix these materials, it's not going to work quite right. That's probably not a good way to do it, right? And for that advanced planning product or project, for the execs, sponsorship, leadership, get your organization in check, fully staffed, right? Don't try to do this halfway. You'll just be asking yourself later why it didn't work, right? So get fully committed. You got to get the right people in the room to do this. It's not for the faint of heart. Perseverance is critical, right? You're going to have pitfalls. And it's going to take some time. This is a full-time project. Don't look for, give the guy, the poor soul, 25% of his allocation is to go work on this sort of solution. I don't think it'll work. Manage your expectations. It is a difficult project, but it's worth the effort, proven in dollars, and I think you'll be comfortable to find it. You'll be happy with the outcome. Sad to say, but it's going to take longer than you think it is, right? We've all been there. We all know this. And just recognize it. Complexities can be overcome. You're talking about an aggressive war room type of situation. You want to get it done. You want the urgency. So plan for pizza. There'll be some late nights for your guys that are trying to make this thing happen. So this is as far as I can tell, an Albert Einstein quote. If you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got, right? You keep doing the same thing over and over, expecting better results, I think someone says that's the definition of insanity. I don't know who said that one. So that, I believe, was it.